The bus had been rigged to fall for the cameras. 11 seconds of engineered freefall off the Hudson overpass. A stunt the network had storyboarded down to the half beat. A coordinator in a van somewhere counting it backward into a headset. The passengers were interns. They had signed waivers. The screaming was real because terror does not read the fine print. But it was screaming with a marketing department behind it. Homelander caught the bus the way a man catches a compliment he believes he deserves. He set it on the overpass with one hand, found the lens that mattered, and let the crowd do the thing crowds do. That rising animal sound a person can mistake if they are sick enough for love. He held the pose a half second past the point of need, because the half second was where the worship lived. Somewhere in the third row of the cordon, a woman with a toddler on her hip and a parking app open on her phone watched the most powerful man in America autograph a child's forearm in permanent marker and thought, with the flat exhaustion of the chronically inconvenienced, that she was going to miss the window on the garage validation. Again, they always closed 6th Avenue for this. They never told you in advance. Then the light changed. It was 4:20 in the afternoon, and the sun was exactly where the calendar said it should be. Low, westering, the ordinary slow gold of a city evening getting ready to happen. The other gold came from the wrong direction. It came from straight up, the way dawn comes, except dawn does not arrive at a single point and widen, and dawn does not have a center. This had a center. The light over Manhattan acquired a source, high, small, brightening, and the temperature of the afternoon shifted by a few degrees in the space of a breath, the way a room changes when someone opens an oven on the far side of it. The crowd looked up. The crowd, which had been built and bussed and wavered to look at Homelander, looked up and away from him all at once. And that, though no one in the marketing van understood it yet, was the single most expensive thing that had happened to the brand in 40 years. He came down slowly. That was the first wrong thing. For anyone keeping a list, things that fall from the sky fall. This descended with the unhurried patience of a man taking the last few steps of a staircase he has walked 10,000 times, and the air did not tear around him, and the sound did not arrive late behind the sight of him. He simply lowered, gold pouring off him in a steady sheet, until the soles of 2 bare feet touched down on the closed asphalt of 6th Avenue, and the heat shimmer of him settled into the shape of an ordinary-sized man. For a moment, it was the most beautiful thing any of them had ever seen, and they cheered, because that is the trained response. The cheer lasted 1 beat too long. It kept going a half second after the part of the animal brain that is older than applause had already gone quiet and cold and begun counting exits. By the time the crowd's mouth caught up to the crowd's spine, the sound had curdled at the edges into something thinner. They did not know why. The light was warm. The man was smiling a little, apologetically, as though he had arrived at the wrong party and was very sorry about it. Nobody was watching the crane. The camera rig, a 40-foot telescoping arm bolted to a flat bed at the lip of the overpass, the thing that had shot Homelander's catch from the heroic low angle, had been left locked in its extended position while every operator on the deck tipped their head back to look at the new sun. The hydraulics had been bleeding pressure for 6 minutes. The boom came down the way a felled tree comes down, slow and then not slow, 40 feet of steel and a half-ton of counterweight folding toward the packed cordon below, toward the woman with the toddler, toward 200 people penned behind a velvet rope for their own safety. He did not catch it. Catching it would have required moving, and he did not move. He looked at it. That was all. A man turning his head toward a problem. And the problem stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. The boom hung at a steep angle over the crowd with its counterweight 3 feet from the skull of a parking app woman who had, a half second earlier, been the most irritated person in New York and was now the most frozen one. A bolt that had sheared loose hung in the air beside her ear, turning, not falling. The dust of the failing rig had kicked off the flatbed hung too, a held gray cloud, each particle stalled in place like a photograph of weather. A pigeon crossing the avenue at the wrong moment hung with its wings open and did not beat them, because there was no longer any such thing in the volume of air the Goldman had decided to attend to, as a next moment for the wings to beat into. Then he reached up, politely, the way a tall man reaches for something on a high shelf for a stranger, took the boom in one hand, and set the entire failing apparatus down on the empty asphalt behind him with a gentleness the situation did not remotely require. The dust resumed. The bolt finished its fall and rang once against the ground. The pigeon, scandalized, beat its wings and left. The crowd came back into time, not knowing it had left, the way a sleeper does not feel the gap. And the woman with the toddler discovered she was crying and could not have said when she had started. Homelander had been the strongest thing in any sky he had ever stood under for his entire life. This is a fact worth sitting with, because a man does not learn the shape of a thing until the thing is taken. And Homelander had never once had cause to learn the shape of his own ceiling. He had hit it exactly never. He had spent 4 decades as the answer to every question a room could ask, and built a self on top of that, the way you build a house on bedrock, never wondering what is under the bedrock. He watched the Gold Man set a 40-foot crane down like a sleeping child, and something in the bedrock moved. So he did what he had always done when a thing made him feel small. He decided to make it dead. The heat vision came off the back of his stare in 2 lines of focused red. Full output, no warning, the killing setting, the one he used on things he wanted gone rather than hurt, crossed the avenue and struck the Gold Man in the back of the skull. Nothing happened. The Gold Man turned around. He turned the way a person turns when they have felt a warm draft against their neck and want, idly, to find the open window. Unhurried, faintly puzzled, already half smiling the apology of someone who suspects he is standing where he shouldn't be. The twin beams that could core a building tracked across his face and did to it precisely nothing. Did not redden the skin, did not so much as make him squint, sheeted off him like afternoon light off a pond. He found Homelander's eyes at the far end of them and said gently, with what could only be described as concern, "Oh, sorry, was I in your way?" There is a specific physics to humiliation, and it has nothing to do with size. Homelander did not get smaller. The cameras would have measured him at exactly the same height, but every person in that plaza, and every person who would later watch the footage, and on some level Homelander himself, experienced the next half second as the most powerful man in America becoming a man, a single man, standing in a street, in a costume, while the actual answer to the room hung the question in the air and apologized for the inconvenience of being it. He had looked up, for the first time in his life, in front of his own crowd, on his own street. He had looked up at someone, and the someone had said sorry, and meant it, which was worse than any insult, because contempt at least confirms you are a rival. Concern confirms you are a bystander. What happened next would not make the footage, because cameras record light, and this was the absence of it, and it lasted less time than a single frame. For 1/2 of 1 second, every shadow in the plaza pointed the wrong way. Not toward the low western sun, not toward the new gold standing in the street. The shadows of 200 people and 40 barricades and 1 righted crane all swung, briefly as one, to point at nothing, at a spot in the empty air a few feet behind the Gold Man's left shoulder, where there was no object and no light and no reason, a spot the shadows treated as the only sun in the world. Then they swung back. No one's eye is fast enough to catch a thing that lasts half a frame. Everyone's animal is. In the same half second, the parking app woman, who had no way of knowing she would think about this instant every day for the rest of her life, had a thought arrive in the center of her head that was not hers. It was small and complete and obscene, a clear, bright wish to do a specific terrible thing to the child on her hip, fully formed in her own interior voice. Gone again before her conscious mind could finish recoiling from it, she held her son tighter. She did not tell anyone. Around the cordon, in ones and twos, other people flinched at nothing, at the ugly stranger that had walked through the back of their skulls and left, and each of them privately decided they were more tired than they had thought, and looked for somewhere to sit down. And the gold just at its edges, just for that half second, was not gold. At the outline of him, where the light met the air, the radiance frayed into something that was not a color, a fringe of absolute black. Lightless, the specific darkness of a thing that does not reflect but eats. There and then, not there. A hairline of nothing tracing the shape of the most beautiful man any of them had ever seen. Then it was 4:20 in the afternoon again, and the sun was where it should be, and a God was standing on 6th Avenue smiling an apology, and the saved were weeping with a joy and a terror they would never be able to separate. And somewhere in after hours, trading Vought stock had already begun to do something historic. The penthouse had been chosen by someone whose job was choosing penthouses. It sat near the top of Vought Tower behind a wall of glass aimed at the skyline, furnished in the colors of a luxury that has never once had to be comfortable, and it had been stocked against a relocation memo nobody had explained to him, with clothing in his size, food he did not recognize, and a framed photograph turned face down on the side table that someone had thought better of and then forgotten to remove. Robert Reynolds sat on the edge of a bed that cost more than the house he was almost sure he had grown up in borrowed clothes, bare feet flat on a floor that did not feel like any floor he remembered. And he was in this room, with no one watching and nothing falling, simply a tired man who could not find his wife. He had tried her name. That was the thing he kept doing, the way you keep pressing a bruise. Somewhere under the noise of the day, there was a name and a face that went with it, and the shape of a morning kitchen and a voice that said his name back. And when he reached for the name itself, Lindy, it was there. He was certain it was there. And then he reached past it for the rest, for the kitchen and the city and the world the kitchen was in, and there was nothing past it. Not a locked door, not a dark room, nothing. The way there is nothing past the last page of a book. He reached, and the world he was reaching for declined, gently to exist, and gave nothing back. And he did not have a word for the specific grief of that. So he simply sat with it, the most powerful being currently alive, unable to locate a single thing that had ever loved him. He looked at the glass, at the skyline burning orange and going blue, at the city full of people he had stopped time to keep from dying that afternoon, who had wept when he saved them, some of whom had flinched from something in the air around him without knowing what. "I just want to do some good," he said to the window, to no one. The voice was quiet and it apologized for taking up the room. "That's all. I want to do one good thing," he trailed off, "and then maybe I could rest." He pressed the flat of his hand to the center of his chest, the heel of it against the sternum, the way a man presses at the start of heartburn, the way you hold a door that wants to open. It was a small gesture, and it looked like nothing, like indigestion, like a tired man's tired hand. He held it there a moment, then he let it drop. He stood and turned away from the glass, away from the burning city and the blue coming down over it, to go and lie down and try, for the first time in a life he could no longer entirely account for, to rest. Behind him, thrown long across the pale floor by the last of the city light, his shadow stayed exactly where it was. It did not turn with him. It kept its face to the window. By 4 a.m, the footage had been screened more times than anyone had counted, and the question in the room was no longer what had come down on 6th Avenue. That question had a boring answer. The question now was what it was worth, and Vought had a department for that. The conference room sat near the top of the tower, glass on three sides. The city below reduced to a circuit diagram of amber and dark. 11 people who were paid not to be impressed sat around a table that had cost more than a house, watching a god in slow motion and being, with considerable professional discipline, not impressed. Stan Edgar did not sit at the head of the table. He sat one chair down on the long side because a man who needs the head of the table has something left to prove. And Edgar had retired from proving things sometime in the previous century. He held a cup of tea he was not drinking. On the wall, 90 feet of monitor showed a 40-foot crane folding toward a crowd and stopping and being set down on empty asphalt like a sleeping child. "Run the flagged frame," Edgar said to the tea. The footage reversed and crawled. A junior analyst, the kind of young man whose entire future was about to be decided by how he narrated the next 30 seconds, walked them through it. There, the reflection. As the subject turned from the stopped crane, his image in the glass of the flatbed's cab had held its old position for a measurable fraction of a second before catching up. A lag, the analyst offered, of roughly 4 frames. And there, the shadows. For a single half frame, every shadow in the plaza had swung to point at a spot behind the man's shoulder where there was no light to cast them. And there, at the edge of him under load, a dark fringe on the gold. A halation, the analyst called it, hopefully. An artifact of the encode. 11 people who were paid not to be impressed looked at a thing the laws of optics could not produce and waited to learn how they were supposed to feel about it, because that decision belonged to the man with the tea. Edgar set the cup down. "Instability," he said. That was the moment, though no one present could have known it, and the man who said it least of all, that an apocalypse was entered into the record as a line item. Not dread, not the cold certainty the older animal had felt all over that plaza 6 hours before. A variable, a containment cost, filed somewhere between a manufacturing defect and a publicity exposure, to be priced and hedged and managed by people very good at all three. The wrongness in the footage was real, and Stan Edgar had seen it more clearly than anyone in the building, and he had filed it exactly one drawer away from the truth, in the drawer marked risk, and slid the drawer shut. An unprecedented opportunity with an unquantified downside, he said. "We will quantify the downside." His eyes moved once down the table. Maya, a woman near the foot of the table, looked up from a tablet she had been typing into without pause. She had not sat down. There was a chair behind her, and she stood in front of it, as if sitting were a commitment she had not yet agreed to make. Her badge clipped square to her lapel, the coffee at her elbow gone cold an hour ago. "Integrate him," Edgar said. "He signs before Tokyo opens. Make him feel wanted." A space that was not quite a pause. "He is going to be wanted a great deal." The room they gave Bob for the meeting had been decorated to feel like trust. By the time the light through the windows had gone from the gray of an unslept night to the flat white of a working morning, Robert Reynolds was sitting at a smaller, warmer table, in clothes that fit because a stranger had guessed his size, holding a pen someone had folded into his hand, across from a woman who talked very fast and kept almost telling him the truth. "You're going to hear the word Sentry a great deal today, and I need you to know it tested." Maya slid a board across the table. His own face was on it, rendered in a gold cleaner than gold had ever managed on its own. "We ran it against 40 alternatives. Sentry holds. It says watching over you without saying watching you, and those pull 11 points apart, which you would not believe what 11 points is worth." She set a contract down beside the board. It was as thick as a city phone book and made a small, dense sound landing. "Most of this you don't read. The parts you read, I've tabbed." Bob looked at the gold version of his own face. "It's very kind," he said. "All of it. The clothes, He gestured at the room, the trust-colored furniture, the view that had been bought for him. It's more than I need. Everybody says that. Maya was 3 pages ahead already, finding the tabs. The ones who mean it are the only ones worth keeping. I just want to be useful. He said it carefully, the way you set down something breakable. If there's something that needs doing, I'd like to be the one who does it. And then, he stopped. The rest of it was, and then be allowed to stop. And he did not say it, because somewhere in the world that no longer answered him, he had learned that you do not get to ask for the second half. I'd just like to be useful, he said again. There was a thing in the way he said it. Maya had spent 9 years building sentences that sand a truth down to something that polls, and she knew the texture of a real one, the way a forger knows good currency by touch. And the real thing in the room was that the most powerful being she had ever stood beside was asking her, in the only language he had left, for permission to put something down. She looked up from the contract. For a second, the crisis cadence dropped out from under her, and what was left was only a person. Bob, you don't have to earn the room. She heard it as it left her, heard exactly how much she meant it, and exactly what she did for a living, and the distance between those two things, which was the precise thickness of the contract on the table. So she did what she was good at. She picked the cadence back up like a dropped phone. Smooth, no crack left showing. But you do have to sign by 10, because Tokyo. She tapped the first tab and edged the pen a half-inch closer. Robert Reynolds, who had just been told he did not have to earn the room and had not believed it for one instant, signed his name on the line that turned him into a product, grateful past speech to be wanted by anyone at all. She had told him a true thing in order to make him sign. She would think about that later. She would have to. Homelander arrived the way weather arrives. He came into the integration suite in the late afternoon with a smile that had its own marketing budget and a warmth that stopped exactly at the surface of his face, and he crossed the room with his hand already out, because Homelander had learned long ago that you take a room by reaching it first. There he is. The smile found its angle. Man of the hour. Man of the... what are we calling it? The decade. It widened by a measured increment. Welcome to the family. Truly, it's not every day you get a new brother. He took Bob's hand, and he squeezed. It was a small thing, performed for an audience of one. A grip pushed past greeting, past firm, into the register Homelander kept for reminding people what their bones were for. The pressure that had on earlier occasions introduced men to the inside of their own hands. It was the only test he had left, now that the heat had done nothing. A question, asked in the one language he had always been fluent in. Nothing happened. Not the nothing of a man enduring pain well. Bob did not set his jaw or hold steady or win the contest, because there was no contest, the way there is none between the tide and a clenched fist. He shook the offered hand warmly, his whole attention on Homelander's face and none of it on the hand, because the hand was not reporting anything his body had a reason to notice. He smiled back, and the smile was real, which was the worst part of it. It's so good to meet you, Bob said. Everyone here speaks so highly of you. I only hope I can be half the help you are. Something moved behind Homelander's eyes that the smile had to work to stay ahead of. He had been the strongest thing in every room he had ever entered, and he had built the entire structure of himself on that one fact, the way you raise a city on a fault and call the ground just ground. Now a man was holding his hand and had not noticed it was being crushed, was looking at him with open and grateful kindness, and hoped to be half as useful. The kindness was unbearable in a way contempt could never be. Contempt would have made him a rival worth hating. This was a stronger thing being nice to him, and there was no room in him built to hold that. Half, Homelander said. The smile held. The voice came out exactly level, which cost him everything he had. Sure, we'll see about that. He released the hand he had not been able to hurt and kept the smile lit all the way to the door. And what he did on the far side of it did not make the footage either. They walked Bob through the launch in a room walled floor to ceiling in monitors, 24 screens running the coronation reel on a loop. The descent, the stopped crane, the gold pouring off him, graded and cleaned until he looked less like a man than like the idea a company has of one. He stood in the middle of 24 versions of himself, trying to be gracious about being worshipped. A runner stood near his elbow with a tablet of cue cards. A kid, maybe 22, 3 weeks into the only job he had ever wanted, close enough to catch the smell that came off the man for no reason anyone could name. Ozone and clean laundry. Bob turned to thank him. On the wall, 24 reflections of Bob turned a quarter-second late. It was nothing. A sync fault, a render lag, 24 screens failing to agree on what time it was, which is what the room would have said had the room been looking, which it was not. For a quarter of a second, the real man faced the runner, while every image of him on every screen still faced front. 24 golden faces turned the wrong way, and then they caught all together and agreed again on where their owner stood. The runner did not see the screens. The runner was looking at Bob's kind, tired, ordinary face saying, "Thank you. You've been so patient with me." And into the middle of the runner's skull, in the runner's own interior voice, arrived a thought. It was about the man's eyes. It was about what they would look like removed. It came fully formed and bright and exact and entirely calm. The wish to do a specific, unforgivable thing to the gentlest person the kid had ever met, and it was gone before his conscious mind could finish recoiling from it. The runner stepped back and dropped a cue card, apologized, white to the lips, said he was sorry, long day, hadn't been sleeping. Bob bent at once and picked the card up and handed it back with both hands. Careful the way you return a thing to someone who is shaking, and asked if he was all right. Did he want to sit down? Did he need water? And the runner looked into the face of the kindest man alive and went on seeing, behind his own eyes, the thought that was not his, and said that he was fine. He was fine. Just a long day. Bob watched him go. Without noticing he was doing it, he pressed the heel of his hand flat to the center of his chest and held it there, the way you hold a door that wants to open. He had not slept since the sky changed. He was beginning to suspect he would not be allowed to. Across the avenue in the dark, a man stood at the window of a building that was not his and watched the coronation play on the side of the tower. They had put the reel on the building itself, 40 stories of new God pouring gold down the glass for the whole city to fall in love with, and most of the city was obliging. Billy Butcher was not most of the city. He stood with a takeaway coffee going cold in his fist. There was a great deal of cold coffee in this story. The whole place ran on it, and watched the golden man set a crane down gently on a loop forever, and felt no awe at all. He had seen the heat vision footage. He understood, roughly, that the thing on the side of the building could end him with about the effort of a passing thought. And the scale of it did not interest him, because the scale was not the problem. Butcher had spent his life around things that could kill him. That was Tuesday. What held him at the glass was smaller and worse. There was a way the gold man moved, a half-second hitch in him, here and there, that the editors had mostly cleaned and not quite, a place where the man in his own image came apart and snapped back together. A seam, and every time it surfaced, the part of Butcher that had kept him breathing through 20 years of looking at monsters in good suits leaned in and said, quiet and certain, the thing it had decided inside the first 10 seconds of watching, that the figure on the side of the building was not a man with powers, that it was a coat, that there was something inside it, wearing it, and the seam was the place where the something didn't quite fit the shape of the man. He had no proof a colleague would look at twice. He had a hitch in some footage, and the oldest instinct he owned, the one that had never once been wrong, about the difference between a man and a thing dressed as one. The whole city looked at the new god and saw a miracle. Butcher looked at the same footage and saw a fit, the kind you hold someone down through. He set the cold coffee on the sill and kept the man in his eye and began, without hurry, to do the thing he was for. At some hour past midnight, with the city gone fully dark beneath it, Stan Edgar read a one-page summary of the day, initialed the foot of it, and approved the rollout. Near the bottom, under a heading that read Asset Stability, a single line noted certain optical anomalies, flagged for monitoring, deemed non-material to launch. Edgar read the line. 6 hours and a great many meetings ago, he had felt, very faintly, the thing the older animal feels. He had filed it under risk, and the file had held all day, and it held now. He initialed the page. The dread was dated now, and signed, and folded into a binder. And a binder is a very safe place to keep an apocalypse, right up until it is not. The machine began to move. 3 floors down, in a dark suite lit only by a screen, a colorist was putting the last polish on the launch reel, making the new god glow clean for the morning. It does not matter what she was called. She would not be in this story long enough for it to matter. She froze on a frame. The descent, the instant his bare feet found the asphalt, and at the edge of him, where the gold met the air, the gold was not gold. A dark halation crawled off his outline, lightless, the photographic negative of a flare, a fringe of pure black tracing the shape of the most beautiful man the cameras had ever loved. Light did not do that. She had never once seen light do that. She flagged the frame and sent it up with a note that asked, more or less, "What is this?" The answer came down 3 rungs, from someone who had been told what the answer was. Halation artifact. Scrub it. He reads pure on camera. She looked at the black a moment longer. Then she did her job. She dragged the slider, and the correction swept across the frame, and the lightless fringe at the edge of the golden man smoothed away into clean, warm, marketable gold. And the thing the camera had caught was gone from every copy the world would ever be permitted to see. Every copy but one. The black stayed in the original file, exactly where it had always been. Dormant, patient, waiting for an eye quick enough to catch it. Across the avenue in the dark, that eye was already open. A plaza that could hold 100,000, and 100,000 came, and several million more watched the feed, because Wout had spent 11 days teaching the world that this was the morning it had been waiting for without knowing. His face was already everywhere by the time the man himself walked out under it. On the buildings, on the buses, on the side of a blimp turning slow circles over the river, gold and clean and 40 feet tall, looking down at the smaller gold version of himself crossing a stage. They had built a god a billboard of his own face to walk beneath, and nobody found this strange. That was the genius of the 11 days. He came out shy. That was the thing the focus groups had not predicted and could not have manufactured. The thing Maya watched land on 100,000 faces from the wings, her tablet forgotten in her hand. The most powerful being alive walked out in front of the largest crowd the city had ever penned into one place, and he ducked his head, and he lifted one hand in a small apologetic wave, as if worried about the inconvenience of being looked at by so many people at once. And the crowd, which had been assembled and instructed and primed to adore him, fell in love for real, all at once, the way you fall for the thing you did not expect inside the thing you were sold. Homelander stood 8 feet to his left, in front of his own name, and felt it go. He had stood on 1,000 stages and taken 1,000 crowds, and he knew the exact weight of 100,000 people loving him, knew it in his chest like a familiar drug. And he stood in his suit with his jaw set in a smile and felt the entire mass of that love slide off him and pour toward the shy man on his left like water, finding the lower ground. Not divided, moved. The cameras found the 2 of them in one wide shot, the established god and the new one. Side by side, the family vault was selling, and in that shot, to every eye that would ever see it, Homelander was the one standing slightly too far forward, trying slightly too hard, a man beside a sunrise. He did not throw heat. He did not crush anything. He kept the smile lit, and he clapped, slow, for the thing that had taken the only food he had ever eaten. And the clapping was the most dangerous sound in the plaza, and not one person heard it. Then a phone in a vault earpiece said a word, and the morning stopped being a ceremony. 11 miles north on the old elevated line the city kept promising to replace, a packed morning train took a curve its rails could no longer hold. The first anyone in the plaza knew of it was the new god's head coming up, turning north towards something none of them could hear, and the apology going out of his face all at once, replaced by something the 11 days of branding had not bothered to test for. Because you cannot focus group the look of a man deciding, instantly and without weighing it, that he is going to go. He went straight up. He did not run off stage to a vehicle. He did not say a word into a microphone. He went up, vertical, off the boards and into the sky over the plaza fast enough that the air closed behind him with a sound like a door. And 100,000 people lost him into the blue, and then found him again on the giant screens, because the choppers had him now, and so did the world. The train had come off the curve. 3 cars of it hung out past the broken rail, over a 60-foot drop onto a freight yard, the couplings shearing one by one as the weight dragged the rest toward the edge. There were 400 people inside. The math of it was simple and old. Mass, a drop, the tensile limit of a coupling that had already failed. And it resolved the way that math always resolves, toward a number the city would have spent a generation grieving. He arrived underneath it. He came up out of the freight yard and put his shoulders under the first car, the way a man stands up under a low ceiling, and the descent of 400 people stopped. Not slowed, not jolted, stopped. The cars settling against him as gently as if they had been lowered onto a pillow by a crane that loved them. Then he began to lift. He raised 3 rail cars and the broken stub of an elevated track on the flats of his hands, level and steady, and held it. And the world watched a man hold up a train the way you would hold up a tray. And somewhere in the held breath of 100,000 people, the cheering started before anyone had decided to cheer. He set the cars down on the flat ground of the yard, one at a time, level, with a care the situation did not require. A care that was, in fact, the entire point of him. A gentleness aimed at frightened strangers who would never know how unnecessary it was. And then he did the thing that finished the world off, the thing no public relations department on earth could have written, because it was too simple and too true. He opened the doors and he went in, and he carried them out. 1 and 2 at a time, the old and the hurt first, cradling each against the gold, murmuring something the cameras could not catch, but which read on the faces of the people he set down, as you're all right. I've got you, you're all right. A man who had just held up a train walked 400 terrified people out of it by hand, as if the strength were incidental and the caring were the whole of him. By the time he was done, the entire country was weeping into its coffee, and the love that had moved across the plaza that morning had become something larger and more dangerous. A worship with a real foundation, the most authentic thing Vought had ever been lucky enough to own. And in the freight yard, in the middle of all that mercy, the thing in him took one of the people he had saved. Her name does not matter much to the story, but it mattered to the man beside her, who was her husband, and who had been on the train, and who had been carried out 3 minutes before she was, and was waiting on the gravel with his hand out for hers. She had walked off under her own power. The golden man had set her at the edge of the yard and turned back for the next one, and she had stood there blinking in the daylight, alive, saved, and she had opened her mouth to say her husband's name. What came out was blood. It came from her nose and then from somewhere behind her eyes, and she went down on the gravel without a sound, folding, the way a person folds when the thing holding them up is simply switched off. And her husband caught her on the way down and started screaming for help in a yard already full of it. The medics were on her in seconds. They worked her hard and they got a heartbeat back, and they ran her to an ambulance. And the senior man on the call wrote the words the apparatus needed written before he had finished thinking them. Crushed trauma, internal, delayed. The curve, the impact, the shock of it. A reasonable thing to write, a true-sounding thing. There had, after all, been a train. Her husband stood where she had fallen and could not stop looking at the spot because some animal part of him knew that the spot was wrong, that people do not bleed from behind the eyes from a derailment they walked away from, that his wife had been alive and saved and standing, and then a hand he could not see had reached into her and turned her off. He had no words for that, so he stood and stared at the gravel while the world around him cheered the man who had carried her out, and the cheering came down over him and his terror like rain that did not know he was there. 60 feet up on the broken track, the golden man set down the last passenger and pressed the heel of one hand flat against the center of his own chest, and did not know why. Billy Butcher had not gone to the freight yard. He had gone to the plaza hours before because the plaza was where the thing would be. And Butcher had learned a long time ago that you do not study a predator by watching the footage. You stand downwind. He had worked himself in close, 3 rows back from the cordon, an unremarkable man in an unremarkable coat in a crowd too busy adoring to notice anything, and he had waited. When the golden man came out shy and the crowd came apart with love, Butcher felt it. It arrived in the middle of his head in his own voice, bright and complete and entirely calm. A thing he might do to the woman beside him, specific and obscene, fully formed, gone before his conscience could finish recoiling. The woman beside him felt her own version of it in the same instant and flinched, hard, and put a hand over her mouth and decided she was overtired. All around him, in ones and twos, Butcher watched 100,000 people receive an ugly stranger into their skulls and step back from themselves and reach for the nearest comfortable lie. Long week, skipped breakfast. Too many people. Butcher did not step back. Butcher turned toward it. He stood in the one spot in the plaza where a man was facing the wrong way, square into the bad feeling instead of away from it, the way you turn into a smell to find the body. The thought had not come from inside him. It had come off the golden man the way heat comes off a road. It was leaking. He left before the train was even on the screens. He did not need the save. He had seen what he came to see. That night, in a room above a shuttered shop that smelled of damp and old smoke, Butcher put a name on a wall. He did not write a manifesto, and he did not say any of it aloud, because there was no one to say it to, and because the kind of certainty he was running on does not survive being spoken to a skeptic. He wrote the name of the woman from the freight yard. It had been on the early wire, before Vought's people got to it, and under it the word yard and the time. Beside her he pinned the runner from the launch suite, a kid he had never met whose breakdown had made one line of a trade rag. Below that, 3 more. A security contractor who had walked off a vault job mid-shift and put his car into a divider, an analyst signed off on stress leave, a colorist gone quiet, people who had been near the golden boy and then had not been all right. 5 names on a wall in a damp room kept by the one man in the country who had turned toward the thing instead of away. He looked at them a while, the way you look at the first 5 points of a shape you cannot yet see. Then he made more coffee he would let go cold, and he kept watching. By the time the city went dark, the line was everywhere. Vaught had taken the thing he had said to a black window on his first night, the thing he had said to no one, the smallest and truest thing he owned, and set it in gold on every surface the country had. I just want to do some good. Trademark pending. It ran in 40-foot letters down the side of the tower under his face. It scrolled across the bottom of the news beneath the freight yard footage on a loop. It was on a coffee cup by morning. The most defenseless sentence a frightened man had ever spoken to the dark had become the most profitable 5 words Vought had moved in a decade. And the obscenity of it was so total and so smooth that it did not register as obscene to the people moving it. Maya stood in the war room at midnight watching the line go up across the skyline, and the thing that happened to her then was the thing she would later have the most trouble forgiving. She found it beautiful. She had written the deck that proposed it. She had argued against a vice president who wanted something punchier, that the power of it was that he had meant it, that you cannot fake the thing that makes people cry, and this was not faked. And she had won, and now it was 40 feet tall and gold and true. She stood in the dark and looked at the most honest thing about the kindest man she had ever met turned into the most successful product she had ever shipped. And some part of her that had once known the difference between those two things looked at the gold and felt only that it was good work. Beautiful work. The handler had spent 9 years selling capes. She had just, somewhere in the last 11 days and without noticing the step, started to believe in one. He came back to the suite a little before 2, and she was there because someone had to walk him through the morning's numbers, and because, she would not have said this part, she did not like the thought of him alone in the trust-colored room after a day like that. He was gray with something that was not quite exhaustion, because exhaustion is a thing the body does, and this was under the body. He had not slept since the sky changed. 5 days. He sat on the edge of the bed that cost more than a house, and Maya stood where she always stood, badge clipped square, the coffee in her hand long cold, and she said something kind, just something small, that he had been wonderful today, that the woman from the train was stable, that he had done a good thing, and the thing in him moved. It happened in the space of a breath. One moment he was a tired man being told he had done good, and the next there was something behind his eyes that was not him, that had heard the word kind and turned toward it the way a current turns toward a drain. Toward her, the one warm thing in the room, the only person being gentle with him. And it wanted. It did not want to hurt her. It was worse than that. It wanted to keep her, to have her, to fold the warmth of her into the dark where nothing else could reach it. And for a fraction of a second, the membrane between that wanting and the world went thin as breath. He came off the bed and away from her, fast, his back hitting the glass, the heel of his hand jamming flat against the center of his chest, pressing, holding the door that wanted to open. And this time the gesture did nothing. He held his hand to his sternum and shook and pressed, and the pressing did not help, had never been the thing that helped, and he hauled the wrongness back up the inside of himself by main force, by want, by the single thing he had left, which was the refusal to let it out. Slowly, slowly, it sank. The gray man came back into his own eyes, sweating, breathing like he had run. Maya was on her feet. "Bob, hey, are you okay?" He looked at her face, which was only worried, which had not understood, which would never know how close the room had just come. And he made himself smile, and the smile cost him more than the train had cost him. "I'm fine," he said. "Sorry, I think I need to sleep." "Yeah." Her hand was half out, the worry plain on her. "Yeah, you really do. You're running on nothing." She believed it because it was even true. He was running on nothing. She just had the cause 1 layer too shallow, the way they all did, the way Edgar had filed it, and the colorist had scrubbed it, and the medic had written it. Nerves, a long day, running on nothing. "Get some sleep, Bob. Everything else can wait." She left him there, and she did not know what she had walked away from, and that not knowing was the only mercy in the room. When she was gone, he did not lie down. He went to the glass instead, and then threw it out onto the high ledge of the tower in the dark, where the wind was, where no one could see, and he stood above the city that loved him and looked down. It was all there beneath him, his face on the buildings, his line in gold down the tower under his feet, and the people, even now near 2 in the morning, the people gathered at the base of the tower in their thousands with their phones up, chanting the name a marketing department had built for him, the name that was not his, sending it up the side of the building in a sound like a tide coming in. And standing above all of it, alone, with the worship climbing the glass toward him, Robert Reynolds understood the shape of the thing at last. Every voice down there was feeding it. He could feel it the way you feel a fire from across a room. That the love was fuel, that the worship went straight down his throat and into the dark and made the dark bigger. That the more good he did, and the more they adored him for it, the larger and stronger and nearer the surface the thing in his chest became. The cure and the disease were one fact. The thing that made him want to keep going was the thing that would end them all. He had wanted his whole displaced life only to do some good and then be allowed to rest. And he had finally been given the doing. And the doing was the poison. And there was no one in all those thousands he could ever tell. Because the brand required the smile. And the smile was the cage. And the cage was failing. He pressed the flat of his hand to the center of his chest. It did nothing. Below him, the city roared his stolen name up into the dark, and all that love came up the glass and broke over him like heat off a fire. There was exactly 1 square yard of the city no camera had ever found. Not by design. Vought left nothing undesigned that it could one day sell. This was an oversight. A fire escape bolted to the north face of the tower, behind a service door 3 floors below the penthouse, hanging out over the part of the skyline the brand had not yet gotten around to owning. No lens pointed at it, no feed ran off it, and at 3 in the morning, with the campaign asleep and the worship gone home, and the whole machinery of manufacturing a god powered down for the night, it was the only place in the world where Robert Reynolds was not being looked at by anyone at all. He was sitting on the cold iron grating with his back against the brick when she found him, knees up, the godhood put away somewhere she could not see. For a moment, Maya stood in the open doorway and saw only a large, tired man in the dark. The way you see a stranger on a stoop and feel sorry for him before you know the first thing about who he is. She had 2 coffees, and both of them were already going cold, because everything in her life went cold before she got to it. She handed him one and lowered herself onto the grating beside him, which she would never have done in daylight, in the building, with the badge doing its work. The badge was still clipped square to her lapel, but it was 3 in the morning, and there was no one out here to be a handler for. "You're supposed to be asleep," she said. There was no cadence in it. The crisis rhythm she ran on for 16 hours a day had finally emptied out somewhere around 2, and what was left was only a woman's voice. "Edgar thinks you're asleep. The entire 11th floor is deeply invested in you being asleep." "I know." He turned the cup in his hands without drinking it. "I'm sorry. I'll try." "That's not—" She stopped, started again, quieter. "You don't have to apologize to me for being awake, Bob. It's a fire escape. There's no camera." He looked at her like that was a foreign country he had once visited. For a while, neither of them said anything, and the city went on doing what cities do in the last hour before they admit it's morning. A far-off siren, a delivery truck somewhere finding a pothole, the long electric hum of a place that never fully stops. Maya watched her own breath and decided to say a true thing, because the badge was clipped on and there was no camera, and it was 3 in the morning, and once in a great while a person gets tired enough to be honest. 9 years I've worked there," she said. She turned the cold cup. "You want to know what 9 years buys you at a place like that? You lose the ability to tell the difference between a thing that's true and a thing that pulls. They take it out of you so slowly that by the end, you thank them for the surgery." She let out something that was almost a laugh and was not one. "I wrote the line, Bob. The one on the buildings. I argued for it in a room. I told them the power of it was that you meant it, that you can't fake the thing that makes people cry. And I was right, and they paid me. And now it's 40 feet tall, and the worst part is, I still think it's good work." She had never said any of that out loud. She watched it sit in the cold air between them and did not take it back. "It was true," Bob said. "When I said it, I did mean it." "I know you did." That was the thing she could not get out from under. That's what made it sellable. He was quiet a moment. Then he said the thing he had never said to a living person, and he said it sideways, the only way it would come. "There was a kitchen." Maya did not move. There was a kitchen with a window over the sink, and the light came in at a certain hour, late, the gold kind, right at the end of the day." His voice had gone very careful, the way you carry a full cup downstairs. "And there was a woman in it. Lindy." The name came out whole and certain, and something underneath it did not. "I can say her name. I can say it the whole way. But when I reach past it, when I try to find her face, the actual face, or the street the kitchen was on, or the name of the town, or whether it was even a town," he opened one hand slowly toward the dark over the city and closed it on nothing. "There's less of it than there was yesterday. Every day there's a little less to reach for. I'm losing the place I'm from one room at a time, and I can't tell anyone, because everyone here is so happy I came." The siren faded out somewhere north. The truck found another pothole. "I'm not asking to die," he said, and it landed so plainly it took her a second to hear how much it weighed. "People think, I see them watch me, and I know what they're afraid of. I'm not asking for that. I just like, once, to be allowed to put it down, to do one good thing and have it be enough, and be allowed to stop." He looked at his own empty hand. "That's the whole of it. That's everything I want. And it turns out it's the one thing nobody anywhere will let me have." Maya looked at the most powerful being who had ever stood beside her, sitting on cold iron in borrowed clothes, asking, in the only language he had left, for permission to be tired. And she did the thing you are not supposed to do. She moved closer, not much. A few inches across cold metal, her shoulder coming to rest against his arm, the warmth of one person finding another in the dark, because there was nothing left in her professional enough to stop it. He went still the way he went still, that enormous, careful stillness, a man afraid of his own scale. And then slowly, after a long time, he leaned the smallest fraction back. That was as far as it went. Two people who had each been alone in a different way for longer than they could say, sitting shoulder to shoulder above a sleeping city, neither of them naming the thing, both of them resting against it. The almost of it filled the whole fire escape. He turned his head and she turned hers, and they were close enough now that she could see the exhaustion sitting behind his eyes like silt at the bottom of clear water. And for one suspended second, the thing that wanted to happen was simple and human and very nearly happened. Then the cold came. It came the way cold comes off an open freezer, all at once from him, pouring off the warm body beside her in a sheet that had no business existing on a summer night. The hum of the city dropped out. The light at the edges of him, the faint, constant gold that never entirely left him, even with the godhood put away, guttered, and at the outline of him, the gold was not gold. It frayed into a fringe of lightless black, a hairline of pure nothing tracing the shape of the man, and the black was looking at her. It did not want to hurt her. That was the obscenity of it, the thing the older animal in her understood a full second before the rest of her caught up. The thing surfacing through him did not reach toward her the way a fist reaches. It reached the way a current reaches a drain, toward the one warm thing on the whole cold metal landing, the only person being gentle with him. And what it wanted was not her pain. It wanted to keep her, to take the warmth of her and fold it down into the dark where the cold was, where nothing could ever reach her or leave her or change her again, and hold her there, safe forever in the silence. It wanted her the way the deepest part of love wants, taken all the way to its end and past it, and the membrane between that wanting and her throat went thin as a held breath. He wrenched back. His spine hit the brick. The cup went over the edge and fell 8 floors without either of them hearing it land. The heel of his hand drove flat against the center of his chest, pressing, holding the door that wanted to open, and the hand did nothing, had never been the thing that did anything, and he hauled the cold back up the inside of himself by the only thing he had left, which was the refusal, the want, the no said by every cell at once. The black at his edges shrank. The freezer cold drew back into him. Slowly, slowly, the hum of the city came back, and the night was a summer night again, and the gold was only gold. And in the last instant of its leaving, in the breath where the dark drained back down out of him, and he had not yet finished returning, Maya looked straight into his face. Where his eyes should have been, there was a hole. Not blackness in the eyes, the absence of them. 2 openings into a lightless nothing that went back and did not stop. The negative of a man, a thing wearing the front of Robert Reynolds with nothing behind the windows. It looked at her out of the place his eyes had been, and it knew her, and it was not sorry. Then it was gone, and it was only Bob. He was shaking. He had both hands pressed to his chest now, and his head was down, and he was saying it over and over, the way a man says it when there are no other words left. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, I'm sorry. Wrecked and small, and more frightened than she was, which she would not have believed possible a minute ago. Behind him the sky had begun, at last, to go gray at its lowest edge, the city admitting the night was over. Maya had seen what lived inside him. She had looked all the way into the hole where the kindest man she knew kept the end of the world, and she understood, with a part of her that did not need anything explained, that this was the truth, and that no one would ever believe her, and that she could spend the rest of her life trying to say it and never find a sentence anyone would take. She did not run. She reached out in the gray coming up of the light, and she put her hand over his hand where it was pressed flat to the center of his chest. It did nothing for the thing underneath. It was never going to do anything for the thing underneath. But his shaking eased a little, the way a man's does when he learns he is not, after all, completely alone on the metal in the dark. She left her hand there. She stayed. The call came at 11 minutes past 4 in the morning, which is the hour the body keeps in reserve for its worst news, the dead trough of the night when the defenses are lowest and the phone is loudest. Maya answered on the first ring because she had not been asleep. She had not slept properly since a fire escape 3 nights before, since a thing with no eyes had looked at her out of the front of a kind man's face, and she had discovered that the dark of her own apartment now held a possibility it had not held the week before. A voice she did not know told her, in the flattened, careful cadence of someone who delivers this news for a living, that the patient from the freight yard incident had coded in the small hours, and that the team had worked her a long time and had not been able to bring her back. They kept calling her the patient. They called her the patient 4 times in 90 seconds, and each time the word came down the line a little smoother, a little more finished, a word being sanded into something that would never catch on a lawsuit. Her name was Dana. By the time Maya reached the hospital, the machine had already been there. It always got there first. A Vought medical liaison she had met twice stood in the corridor outside the family room with a tablet and a face arranged for grief, and he walked her through the language before she had her coat off, the way you brief a colleague before a press line, because that is what this was. The deceased had a prior vascular condition, Undiagnosed, tragically, these things so often were. The extraordinary stress of the derailment had, in the clinical opinion now being finalized, set off a catastrophic event the body had been carrying silently for years. A coincidence of terrible timing. Nobody's fault. Certainly nobody's liability. He said it cleanly. He had not been on the gravel. He had not seen a woman walk off a train under her own legs and open her mouth to say her husband's name and bleed instead. He had a tablet and a condition that fit, and 3 rungs above him a decision had already been made about what was true. He was very good at his job, which on this particular morning was building a coffin for the truth and getting the lid screwed down before anyone who had been there could be heard over the drill. Maya knew exactly where the death had come from. She had seen the thing that made it, the cold pouring off a gentle man, the black at his edges, the eyeless dark that wanted to keep what it loved. She stood in a corridor at 5 in the morning, holding the one piece of information that mattered, alone and unsayable, and watched a man with a tablet file it under a vascular condition. And she understood that if she opened her mouth and said the true thing, she would say it to people who would, very kindly, arrange for her to go somewhere she could rest. So she took the tablet, and she went in to lie to the family. Dana's husband was sitting with his hands open in his lap, palms up, the way people sit when they have been holding something for hours and someone has finally taken it and they have not yet remembered how to close their hands. A sister beside him, an older woman who might have been a mother, a paper cup on the table between them, untouched, gone cold. Maya sat, "You do not stand over the grieving," and she said the company's name and the company's sorrow and the company's commitment to the family in this difficult time. She used the word condition. She used the word sudden. She built the sentence in real time in the room, watching it land, and it came out of her smooth and warm and finished, 9 years of training delivering itself through her mouth while the rest of her stood behind her own eyes and watched, appalled. "She walked off the train," the husband said, not an accusation. The one fact he could not fold into the shape they were handing him. "I was on the gravel. I saw her. She walked off on her own legs and she found me, and she looked right at me." His open hands moved helplessly. "People don't." She was fine. She was standing right there, and she was fine, and now you're telling me she'd been sick for years and nobody knew. He looked at Maya, and there was no anger in it, which was worse than anger. "How does that happen?" "It does not happen," Maya did not say. "It happens because the man who carried her out of that train has something living inside him, and it brushed past her on the way through and switched her off. The way it nearly switched me off 3 nights ago on a fire escape in the dark. There is no condition. There was never a condition. There is only the thing no one will let me name." "I'm so sorry," she said instead. "I wish I had a better answer. Sometimes there just isn't a reason that makes it hurt less." That last part was true. She had reached out of 9 years of practice lying for one true thing to hand him. The way she had handed Bob one true thing to make him sign. And she understood, hearing herself do it, that this was the shape of her life now. True things, deployed in the service of a lie, because the lie went down easier with a little honesty stirred in. The husband nodded. He believed her mostly because believing her was easier than the alternative his animal kept offering him, and grief takes the path of least resistance, the same as water does. He thanked her. He thanked her. Maya made it to the end of the corridor and into a stairwell before her legs stopped agreeing to the plan, and she sat down on a concrete step and put her face in her hands and did not make a sound. Because even now the training held, and a woman who cries silently in a stairwell is a woman who has learned exactly who is always listening. The same gray light was coming up over the city 3 floors above her, into a room where a man who could not be hurt was failing, quietly, to mourn. Bob sat on the floor with his back against the bed. Not on it. The bed was for a man who could sleep. He was trying to remember his wife's face. He could get the kitchen, the window over the sink, the late gold light at the end of the day. But when he reached for the woman at the sink, there was a shape, a warmth, a height, the suggestion of someone turning toward him, and where the face should resolve, the specific beloved geometry of a specific human face, there was only a softness the memory declined to fill in. He pushed at it the way you push a word on the tip of your tongue. Lindy. The name came whole. The name had always come whole. And the name opened onto a door, and the door onto a room, and the room was empty. And getting emptier, the furniture of his own past carried out a piece at a time by movers he could not see and could not stop. He had tried the first week to look for her. The brand had given him reach, credentials, the whole searchable apparatus of a company that could find anyone. He had typed her name into it one night, and the system returned nothing. Not a redaction, not a sealed file. The specific, total nothing of a search for a person who left no trace because there was none to leave. Because the world that held her did not touch this one and never had. There was no Lindy. There was no town. As far as every record this reality kept, there was no Robert Reynolds either. Before the morning the sky went gold. A man with no past searching for a wife with no existence, in a world delighted to have met him and with no idea where he had come from. He had thought grief needed an object, a grave, a stone, a photograph, a person other people also remembered. He was learning there is a worse grief than the kind with an object, the grief that cannot confirm its own cause, that mourns a shape it can no longer see, into a silence that gives nothing back, that cannot be shared because there is no one alive in all the world who can say, yes, she was real, I remember her too. He pressed the heel of his hand flat to the center of his chest, not against the thing inside him this time, just because it was where the ache was, and a man holds the place that hurts even when holding it has never once helped. On the sill beside him, a small potted thing the relocation team had set there for warmth went, in the space of his grief, from living to not. It did not wilt. Wilting takes water and time. It simply stopped. The green drained to a brittle brown from the roots out, the leaves curling as if a year had crossed them in a breath. A small, cold death blooming outward from the man on the floor, who had gone too far down inside his own loss to keep the lid all the way shut. He did not notice. That was the thing about him that should have frightened everyone more than the power ever did. He was grieving so hard he did not feel the world quietly dying within reach of his hand. Maya came up to the penthouse a little after 7 because she did not know where else to put herself, and because some part of her she had stopped being able to argue with needed to see that he was still Bob. She found him on the floor. She saw the dead plant on the sill, registered it, filed it with everything else she carried and could not say, and did not mention it. She lowered herself down beside him, her back against the same bed, the badge still clipped to a lapel she had not changed since yesterday, and for a while the two of them sat on the floor of the most expensive room in the city and said nothing at all. She was carrying a corpse. He was carrying a woman who had never, in this world, been born. Neither could give the other the real weight of it. She could not say a stranger died in the night and it was you. He could not say I am losing the only thing I have left and there is no one to tell. So they sat with their separate, unspeakable losses a few inches apart, grieving past each other in the gray morning, two people each alone inside, a sorrow the other could see the edge of and never the middle. "The woman from the train," Bob said at last, looking at the city. "Maya, tell me she's all right." Maya did not answer fast enough. He turned his head and read it off her face. Not the truth underneath it. He did not know about the cold he had poured into Dana on his way past, but the plain human fact that the woman he had carried out in his own arms had died in the night. The man who could stop time and shrug off a killing beam received, defenseless, the one piece of news there was no power on earth that could do anything about. I carried her out, the full cup down the stairs voice. I had her right here. She was breathing. I felt her breathing. He looked down at the hands that had held 3 rail cars level over a freight yard that could not be cut or burned or broken. What's the use of it? He said. What is it for? All of this. He turned one hand over and closed it on nothing. I just want to do some good. It was the line, the one they had taken from him and made 40 feet tall under his own face. He said it the way he had said it the first night to a dark window, plain and meant. But it came out hollow now, the way a word goes hollow when the person saying it has begun, somewhere underneath, to suspect it of something. He could not have told her what. He only felt the shape of it pressing up, that the wish and the wound had started to be the same wish, that the good he kept reaching for kept arriving with a cost he could not see and could not stop, and that a woman he had carried in his own arms was dead in a bed across the city because he had been there, being good, when she had needed him to have been anywhere else. Maya looked at the kindest man she had ever met, say the kindest thing he owned and not believe it anymore, and she made a decision she would not be able to take back. She did not do it that morning. She did it that night, after a day of running the lie up and down the building, after she approved the condolence package and signed off on the statement and watched the death become, on every screen, a tragic medical event the brave Sentry had heroically tried to prevent. She did it alone, in the dark, with the lights off. There was a name she had spent 9 years not thinking about. A man Voight's legal team kept a standing flag on. Not a journalist, not a rival, something harder to file. A man who, the cleaning crew said and the lawyers confirmed in memos she was not supposed to read, kept a list. Who had been quietly collecting the company's quiet deaths for years. The ones written up as conditions and coincidences in terrible timing. The bodies that turned up in the wake of capes and never quite added up. Every few months his name crossed a desk with the word hostile beside it, and every few months it was decided again that he was better left alone than martyred. She had buried that name on purpose, the way you bury a door you are afraid of one day opening. She found it again in 20 minutes. She sat in the dark with the channel open and the cursor blinking, and she thought about a fire escape and an eyeless dark and a husband with his hands open in his lap, and a woman who walked off a train and bled, and the kindest man alive saying, I just want to do some good, in a voice that had stopped believing it. She typed, I work at Vought. The deaths around the new one aren't what they're telling you. I've seen what he is. Her thumb sat over it a long time, because sending it was the end of one life and the start of a worse one. Then she sent it. The message went out into the dark toward a man who kept a list, who had 3 nights before pinned a 5th name to a wall in a damp room above a shuttered shop, and who that very morning had drawn a hard line under the first of those names, because the woman from the freight yard had stopped being someone who got hurt near the Golden Boy and become the first one to die of it. He did not yet know that a woman inside Vought was reaching for him through the dark. He only knew the pattern had just grown teeth. A mile up in the cold, thin air above the tower, where the satellites were and the cameras were not, Homelander had been watching for 3 days. He had not been able to hurt the new god, and so he had done the only thing left to a creature built entirely around being the most dangerous thing in any room. He had started looking, with the patience of something that has all the time in the world and nothing left to lose, for the place where the unhurtable man could be hurt anyway. It was not a hard search in the end. It never was. Finding the soft place in people was the one talent Homelander had ever truly trusted. More reliable than the heat, more reliable than the flight. And the soft place in a god who could shrug off the sun turned out to be so human, so small, so gratifyingly ordinary, that he had nearly missed it, looking for something grander. The unbreakable man went careful around one woman. 3 days of footage and a few patient hours of his own eyes had shown him the way the new god's whole enormous attention bent and softened whenever the handler came near. The way he lowered his voice for her, angled his body toward her, went still around her the way you go still around a thing you are afraid of dropping. The strongest creature alive had a hand. He pressed flat to his chest when he was frightened. And the only person in the building who could make that hand unclench was a mid-level crisis communications manager with a badge clipped square to her lapel and a coffee that was always going cold. You did not have to be stronger than a god. The understanding spread behind Homelander's eyes like warmth returning to a frozen hand. You did not have to outfight him or outburn him. You only had to find the one small mortal thing he would get down on his knees to keep safe. And then you owned the god, the whole impossible weight of him, held in your fist by one human throat. He pulled her file on the way down. It took a thought, a name, a face, an address, a life laid open in the time it took to fall 100 feet. Maya Cole. Homelander smiled all the way, for the first time since a man had fallen out of the wrong sky, and apologized for being in his way. The op had a shape, and the shape was a comfort, because the crew had run this exact shape 100 times. A soup had killed a civilian, reduced any job they had ever taken down to a single sentence, and that was the sentence. A woman had walked off a derailed train alive and bled out on a freight yard 3 minutes later, and a hospital had written a word that did not fit the body, and somewhere inside the machine that manufactured gods for a living, the death had been sanded into a coincidence with a convenient prior condition. Marvin had known the shape of it before he had the file in his hand. He had been reading that shape off the world since before half his crew were born. The file itself had come from a place files do not come from. Marvin did not ask where. Butcher did not offer. There is a texture certain information carries. The fingerprints of a person on the inside who has reached a specific kind of floor and decided they would rather burn the house down than keep living in it. And the thing they were working from had that texture on every page. A meeting that had happened without anyone meeting. Marvin filed the question under not now, the way he filed everything that could wait, in its drawer in order, and laid the op out flat. They took him underground. Not by force. There is no by force for a thing like him, a fact the crew did not yet understand and were about to learn at the only tuition rate the world charges, which is all of it. They took him into a sub-level parking structure beneath a vault annex at 2 in the morning, into the one kind of place the brand's cameras never reached, the concrete and sodium nowhere where the worship did not go. He came down because his route brought him down. He could have been a quarter-mile up and gone before the first man moved. He stood instead in the orange light with his hands loose at his sides and looked at the people who had come to hurt him with an expression Butcher had never once seen on a cape's face and did not have a slot for. He looked sorry. He looked like he was trying to think of how to do this without anybody getting hurt. Frenchie went first because Frenchie's whole art was the thing that worked when nothing else did. The dart took him in the throat, a cocktail that had folded stronger men than any cape into a heap on a warehouse floor, that had dropped enhanced targets the crew had spent months learning to drop. It went in clean. Nothing happened. Frenchie put a second compound into him, the one that ate through compound 5 like acid through wax, the fail-safe, the thing he did not show people. Nothing happened. Marvin's restraints, the alloy, the load-rated everything, the kit that had held a man who could bench a bus, closed around the golden wrists, and the golden man let them, watched them close with a kind of patient sadness. And when the hydraulics took up the slack, the metal simply gave, parting around him like a ribbon around a held breath, because there was no version of those wrists that the metal had any opinion about. Nothing happened. Kimiko came in off the high line and hit him at the base of the skull, with everything a body that heals from anything can throw. The strike that ended fights, and it landed, and it was nothing. Less than nothing. The gold not even shifting under it. And she rebounded off him the way you rebound off a wall that was always going to be there, and rolled and came up, and looked at the things she had just punched with the first real fear Frenchie had ever seen her wear. Hit, nothing. Hit, nothing. The crew that had beaten everyone ran the whole playbook in 90 seconds, and the playbook came back blank. Every page, and the part of each of them that had built a life on the playbook working felt the floor of it tilt. And the man apologized. "Please," the golden man said, hands open, the restraints hanging off his wrists in pieces. "Please stop. You're going to hurt yourselves. I don't want to hurt you. Whatever you think I did, I think there's been..." His voice caught on the size of the misunderstanding. "I think we can just talk. Please." Butcher in the dark behind the vehicles did not move and did not speak, and watched a thing that could core the building, beg 5 people not to break their own hands on it. And the oldest instinct he owned leaned in and went very quiet and very cold. Then Kimiko, snarling, came in again, and the thing in the golden man reached for her. Not him. It. The cold came off him all at once, the freezer cold that did not belong in a summer night underground, and the light at his edges guttered, and at the outline of him the gold frayed into a hairline of lightless black, and the black turned toward the small, fierce woman who could not be killed by any wound the world stocked, and reached for her along an axis no wound the world stocked ran down, not to break her, to take her, to switch her off and fold her down into the cold where the regeneration could not follow, because there is no healing from being kept. He got between it and her. He moved, the only fast thing he had done all night, and put himself between Kimiko and his own dark, his own back to her, his own body the wall, shielding the woman who had just tried to cave his skull in from the thing that lived inside him, holding it off her by main force, his face wrenched with the effort of being the cage around the thing that wanted the person attacking him. The most dangerous being in the structure spent everything he had protecting a hunter from himself. That was when the phone rang. It was his own phone, the VOT issue thing in his pocket, and it should not have mattered, except that the voice on it, when his shaking hand found it and the screen lit, was bright and warm and delighted, and behind the voice, small and frightened and trying not to be, was another voice he knew. "There he is. Homelander, gentle as a knife going in. Hope I'm not interrupting. You're a hard man to get alone, you know that? But I found something of yours. Funny, turns out even you keep one little thing where you can lose it." A pause built for the cruelty inside it. "Say hello, sweetheart. He's listening." And Maya's voice somewhere across the city, in a grip he could feel from here. Bob, don't. I'm okay. The one mortal thing he would have knelt in front of the world to keep safe was in the hands of the one creature in it that wanted to use her, and Robert Reynolds, who was holding the dark off a stranger's life with both hands and his whole exhausted will, felt his whole exhausted will turn all at once toward her. And the cage, which had been failing all night under the weight of 5 trained people pulling on a grief-starved man who would not pull back, came open the rest of the way the instant his attention left it. There was a man in the structure no one had counted, a night attendant in the glass booth at the ramp, 60-some, a thermos of coffee gone cold beside him, and a phone propped against it showing him pictures of grandchildren he had been scrolling between cars. A man who was not supposed to be in anybody's op because the op was about a soup and not about the people in the building, which was the whole error of the thing and always had been. He had stood up at the noise. He had come 2 steps out of his booth to see. The dark let off its leash for half a second, did not even turn toward him with intent. It simply expanded. The way held breath expands the instant the holding stops, and brushed past him on its way into the world. The attendant's coffee, the cold of it, had nothing on what came off the golden man. He opened his mouth to call out, to ask what was happening, to say a grandchild's name. No one would ever know which. And what came out was blood. It came from behind his eyes the way it had come from behind Dana's. And he folded, the way a person folds when the thing holding them upright is switched off at the source, and he was on the concrete and finished before the sound of his own knees hitting it had stopped. And the dust hung. It hung the way dust had hung over a frozen plaza 11 days before. The whole structure held for one suspended, unbearable instant in a stillness that came off the golden man. Except this time, there was a body under the dust. An ordinary man dead on the floor of a parking garage with his thermos cooling in his booth. Killed by a thing that had been, in the same breath, the same instant, the same indivisible act, holding itself off a woman it could not reach in order to spare her. His good hand and his killing hand were the same hand. They had always been the same hand. The world had simply never made him use both at once where someone could watch. The crew came apart in their separate ways, fast in the held quiet. Huey made a sound that was not a word, a young man's whole nervous system rejecting what his eyes had sent it. Marvin's mind ran the math, and the math did not resolve, and ran it again and got the same wrongness. A lifetime of operating models all giving the same impossible answer. That the thing they had come to fight had just saved one of their own and murdered a stranger in a single motion it had been fighting not to make. Frenchie had Kimiko by the arm, both of them staring, and the dawning thing on Frenchie's face was the worst thing of all, because Frenchie understood chemistry and Frenchie understood that there was no chemistry here. Nothing in any of his needles that had a target. No enemy in the room that a weapon could be pointed at. Butcher was on the floor. He had moved when the cold first came, the way he always moved, toward the threat. And the expanding dark had caught the edge of him on its way past, had reached 2 fingers into the back of his skull and shown him, for a quarter second, the inside of the thing, the lightless going back and back of it, before the golden man hauled it home and Butcher dropped, gasping alive, with something in him that had not been there before and would never fully leave. From the floor with his cheek against the cold concrete and a stranger's blood spreading toward him, and the worst thing he had ever felt still ringing in the back of his head, Billy Butcher saw it clearest. They had not come to fight a soup. There was no soup to fight. There was a man, a frightened, exhausted, decent man, the only decent one Butcher had ever found wearing that kind of power. And the man was on their side, was fighting the only real enemy in the building, was the cage and not the beast, and was losing. The thing they had spent the whole night pulling on was the lid. They had come to break the lid. They had nearly succeeded. "Fall back," Butcher said. He had never said it. In 20 years, he had never once called a crew off a cape with the cape still standing. The order came out of him low and certain, and it was not a tactic. It was a verdict. The most damning red he would ever deliver, delivered flat on his back at the lowest he had ever been. The recognition that everything he was, every instinct that had kept him breathing, had just been pointed at the wrong target in a room where the right target could not be fought. "Everybody, now, get out. We had it wrong. We had the whole bloody thing wrong." They went. Frenchie hauled Butcher up, and Kimiko got Huey moving, and Marvin took one long last look at the math that would not resolve. And the crew that had beaten everyone retreated from the one job they could not do, leaving the structure and the dust in the dead man cooling beside his thermos. Butcher went last. At the mouth of the ramp he stopped, because he could not and look back. The golden man was standing over the body he had not been able to save. Both hands were pressed flat to the center of his own chest, the heels of them hard against the sternum, and he was shaking, and he was not looking at the people fleeing him, or at the night that had broken open, or at anything in the world, but the thing inside himself that he was holding shut with everything he had left. The only thing that mattered, the lid jammed back down by hand over the dark that had just killed an innocent and reached in the same motion to spare a stranger. Butcher had hated every cape he had ever met. He had built a life on it. He stood at the mouth of the ramp and watched the most dangerous being alive hold the dark shut with both hands over a body it had made. And he understood that this was the only one of them who had ever been trying, and that the boys had just spent the whole night helping it lose. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not say a word. He watched the golden man hold the dark. Homelander had chosen the roof. The roof was the sky, near enough, and the sky was the one thing he had ever owned without an asterisk. The place where, his whole life, there had been nothing above him and nothing that could reach down to him, where he had gone to be the only thing of his kind in all of creation. He had dragged the woman up here, because up here was his. He still did not understand, even after a killing beam off the back of a skull had done nothing, and a bone grip had crushed nothing. That height is a human idea. That the man he had summoned to this rooftop did not experience up the way the rest of the world did. That there is no getting above a thing that fell out of a sky that was not this one. He had Maya by the back of the neck. Not hard, not yet. Just enough. One gloved hand closed at the joint of skull and spine, in the particular grip that informs a body exactly how breakable it is. Holding her on her knees at the lip of the helipad with the gray of the coming dawn behind her, and the city going from black to slate 40 stories down. Her badge was still clipped square to her lapel. She had been lifted out of her own apartment in the clothes she had worn to bury a stranger, and somewhere in the last hour she had stopped trying to talk her way free, because 9 years had taught her the exact moment talk stops working, and this was well past it. The sentry stood 8 feet away, where he had been told to stand, and did not move. "There," Homelander said. "See? This is nice. Us, getting to know each other." The smile he wore had been built in a lab and tested against a nation, and it was working as hard as it had ever worked. "You came right up when I called. I respect that." He tilted his head toward the kneeling woman without quite looking at her. "She said you would. Said you'd come for her. Funny thing for a god to have. A her." Something flickered under the warmth. "So here's all I want. One thing. I want to see the real you. Not the press version, not the holding up a train and carrying everyone out by hand version. That's for them." A jerk of his chin at the sleeping city. "I'm not them. You fell out of the wrong sky and made my whole life look like a costume party. Fine. Point taken. So show me, hit me, or get down on your knees, one or the other. Show me which animal you actually are." The hand at her neck tightened by a measured degree, and she made a sound, small, bitten off. "And I'd decide soon. She's got a lovely neck, and I get bored." "Let her go!" The sentry's voice was very quiet and very level. The levelness of enormous and invisible effort. "Please, whatever you want, I'll do it. I'll stand here. I'll let you do anything you want to me, anything at all. But you have to let her go. You don't understand what's—" He stopped. The rest of the sentence needed air he could not spare. "Please." And there was the trap the rooftop could not see. He could give Homelander neither of the two things he had demanded. He could not hit him. Not for mercy alone, though there was that, but because the only blow he had left was the end of the world. The same thing he had held shut with both hands over a body in a garage an hour before. And he could not kneel, not in the way Homelander needed him to, because kneeling was a kind of letting go. And he could not afford to let go of anything tonight. Not one muscle, not one degree of attention. He had exactly one job. He had had one job since the sky changed. He stood 8 feet from the only person in this world who had ever laid a hand over his and held the lid down. and the choice he was being offered did not exist. 40 stories below, Stan Edgar watched a feed of his single most valuable asset standing very still on a rooftop, while his single most dangerous one held a mid-level employee by the throat, and discovered the precise limit of how much a man can manage a god. The limit is exactly as much as the god permits, and not 1 ounce past it. He had a voice in Homelander's ear. Homelander had stopped listening to it an hour ago. On the desk in front of Edgar, dated and initialed, sat a binder marked Asset Stability, in which certain optical anomalies had been filed as non-material to launch, and which was becoming, minute by minute, the worst aged document in the history of the company. See, here's the thing. Homelander crouched, bringing his face down level with Maya's, talking over her head the way you talk over a child's. Everybody's got a string. I've been doing this a long, long time, and there is always a string. He had pulled 1,000 of them. It was the only intimacy he had ever been any good at. So this afternoon I went looking for yours. Had the whole building looking. You would not believe what I can learn about a man in an afternoon. He had learned nothing, and he had not finished being unsettled by it, which was part of why his grip kept tightening. A man leaning harder on a button that refuses to light. He had reached first for the family because there is always a family. A wife, a mother, a child, someone whose face in a photograph makes a strong man go soft and do as he's told. The one tender word the surveillance had caught the god murmur to a dark window, Lindy, had come back empty, not sealed, not protected. Empty, the resounding nothing of a search for a person who had never, in this world, drawn a single breath. He had struck, without knowing it, the exact wall the man across from him had struck alone in a penthouse 5 nights before. Where Robert Reynolds had stood at that wall and grieved, Homelander stood at it and felt only a baffled, climbing fury. A hunter whose snare keeps shutting on empty air. He had reached for exposure, the secret, the shame, the buried thing a man would kneel to keep buried, and found there was nothing to expose, because there was nothing to find. The Golden Man did not exist, not in Vault systems, not in any nations, not in any place a record is kept. Before the morning the sky turned gold, there had been no Robert Reynolds at all, a creature assembled entirely out of manufactured history, a vat, a legend, a childhood drafted by committee, knelt on a rooftop holding a woman by the neck, and could not get one finger's purchase on a being with no history whatsoever. And somewhere beneath the fury was a thing Homelander would never name and would never admit he felt. That of the two of them, the one with nothing behind him was somehow the more real, and the one built entirely out of borrowed past was the ghost. Of everything the building had turned over, exactly one thing had lit up, and it was so small and so ordinary that he had nearly thrown it back. A handler, a crisis communications manager with a badge clipped square to her lapel and a coffee always going cold. There was no record of where the god came from, and therefore nothing to hold him by, except the one thing he had made matter after he arrived, the single seam in all that armor, and he had cut it into himself with his own hands. That was the obscenity of the arithmetic, a being you could not threaten with his dead, his past, his shame, or his pain, because in this world he owned none of them, had been made grippable by the one human kindness he had let himself have, a fire escape, a hand laid over his hand in the gray. The 10 minutes he had let the lid up to be a person. The bill for those 10 minutes had come due on a rooftop, and it was sitting in Homelander's fist. So Homelander did the thing he was for. He squeezed, not to kill, to pry, to provoke, to make the Gold Man move. He pressed his thumb slow into the side of Maya's throat and watched the Gold Man's face for the thing he was owed. The rage, the lunge, the fight that would finally make this real, that would let him lose to something worth losing to, instead of being apologized at by it. The sentry did not move. He held himself so still that the stillness took on mass, a man bracing under a weight no one else could see, and he watched the woman he loved take a thumb into her throat, and he did not take the one step that would have ended Homelander, and the rooftop, and Vought Tower, and a good part of the borough beneath it, because that step and that ending were the same step and the same ending. He had decided, was deciding, second by second with everything he had left, that he would stand here and watch her hurt before he would let the thing inside him out to save her. To Homelander it read as fear, the larger animal baring its throat. That was the only grammar Homelander owned for a stronger creature that would not fight. Submission, the world finally turning the right way up, and it fed something starving in him at the same time it confused him, because the submission had the wrong shape, was too still, too willed, had none of the broken cringe of a thing that has been beaten. He had never once in his life met restraint, and so he had no slot to put it in, and the not knowing made him bear down harder. The horror of it was simple. Every notch he tightened to break the god's stillness was a notch taken off the cage the stillness was holding shut. He was prying at the lid and calling it winning. He thought he was in a fight. He was pulling a pin. In the man's chest, behind the stillness, the dark leaned on a will that was thinning by the minute, and the man's hands wanted so badly it was its own kind of agony, to come up flat against his own sternum, both of them, to hold the door the only way his body knew how. He would not let them. He could not let Homelander see the gesture, could not hand him one more thing to read, and so he kept his hands at his sides by the same will that held the lid. And the price of holding both at once was a fine tremor that began in his fingers and started slowly to climb his arms. Maya had stopped looking at Homelander. She was looking at Bob, at the tremor he was fighting to still, at the gold guttering at his edges the way a flame gutters in a draft, at the exact quality of the stillness. And she was assembling it the way she assembled everything, fast against her own will. The handler's curse of seeing the whole board a beat before she wanted to. She knew what the gold going thin meant. She had seen what came through that thinning 3 nights ago, in the gray, reaching for her. And she understood, on her knees with a thumb in her throat, the thing that was worse than dying, that Bob was holding the world shut for her sake, that every second he refused to save her was a second the lid slipped, and that the moment he finally chose her, the moment he moved, as every cell in him was screaming to move, would be the moment it all came open. Her rescue was the end of the world. She had been the end of the world since the fire escape and had not known it, and now she did. So she did the only thing left to her. She could not speak. The grip had taken that, and anything she said would have gone to Homelander too, and Homelander could not be allowed to understand the shape of what he was holding. So she said it with her body, in the one language that belonged to her and Bob and no one else. She brought up her free hand, slow, shaking, the arm he had not pinned, and pressed the flat of it to the center of her own chest, the heel against her own sternum. The gesture from the fire escape, the one she had laid over his hand in the dark, given back to him now, reversed. "Hold it," said her hand. "Don't let go. Don't you dare come for me. I am not worth the world." He saw it, and seeing it nearly broke him the other way, that she had understood, that she was kneeling there asking him to let her die to keep the lid down, and that she was right. On the access stair, in the shadow of the housing where the elevator machinery lived, Billy Butcher had a rifle up and was not firing it. He had come the way you always come, following the thing you hunt, and he had arrived to a tableau he could not have drawn a target list for. He had the weapon trained, and the oldest instinct he owned, the one that had been wrong exactly once, an hour ago, on a garage floor and had spent the hour since relearning the world from scratch, would not let him take the shot because he could see the architecture of it now. Clean. The man in gold was not the threat on this roof. The man in gold was the lid. The laughing one with the woman by the throat was prying it off and did not know it. And if Butcher put a round through the laughing one, even if it landed, even if by some miracle it did the job, it would not stop the dark. It might only take the lid's attention off the dark for the half a second the dark needed to get out. There was no shot on this rooftop that did not end the world. The man whose whole life was the shot lowered the rifle and watched the wrong man, and for the first time since he was a boy, did not know what he was supposed to do. Homelander was losing the scene, and he could feel it. The god would not fight. The god would not break. A thumb in a throat had not bought the thing he was owed. The submission was the wrong shape. The begging had stopped. And worst of all, none of it was about him anymore. The two of them were looking at each other, the gold man and the handler, holding some entire silent conversation he was not part of, on his roof, in his sky. Homelander had spent his whole life unable to bear being the one thing in the room that no one was looking at. So he stopped trying to make the god move and decided instead to make him watch. If the gold man would not answer a threat, he would answer a fact. Homelander would do the one thing there is no standing still through, and he would do it slowly, so the god would have to choose, in front of him, at last, which animal he really was. He looked the Sentry in the eyes. He gave him the real smile, the one no committee had ever built, and he turned his head a few degrees toward the woman kneeling at the edge of his roof, and behind his eyes 2 points of red began, unhurried, to warm. Maya's hand was still flat against her own chest. "Hold it! Don't!" And Robert Reynolds, who had stood through a killing beam, a crushing hand, a thumb in the throat of the only thing he loved, who had decided over and over all night long that he would watch her hurt before he would let the world die, found the floor of himself. The place underneath the deciding, where the deciding does not reach. He could watch her threatened. He had learned tonight that he could even watch her hurt. He could not watch her killed. It was not a choice. That was the thing the whole long night had been built to arrive at, and the thing Maya's hand had been trying to forbid. That beneath the will, beneath 11 days of holding, beneath the good and decent and unspeakably tired man, there was a reflex older than all of it, the one that cleared the civilians before every fight, that caught every falling thing and set it down gentle, that had always reached for the one in danger. And the reflex did not stop to ask him. It saw the red begin to warm toward her throat, and it moved. He moved. For the first time on the roof, the Sentry took a step and gave Homelander, at last, exactly what he had demanded all night. The full and undivided attention of the strongest being alive, turning toward him, fast and final, the whole of it bent on the space between the warming red and Maya Cole. And the will that turned toward Homelander let go, in the very same motion, of the thing it had spent 11 days holding shut. The gold went out. It did not fade. It poured off him in its sheet, and then it was simply gone, drawn inward and down as though the man were a drain the light fell into. And what rose up out of the place where Robert Reynolds had been standing was the same height and the same shape, and was not him. The cold came off it the way it had come off the garage, off the fire escape, the freezer cold, wrong in the warm gray air. The light bent around it the wrong way. And it finished turning toward Homelander, toward the thing that had been about to harm the one it wanted to keep. And it gave him the eyes he had spent all night demanding. There were no eyes. Where the kindest face anyone had ever seen kept its eyes, there were 2 openings into a lightless going back and back, the negative of a man, the same eyeless dark that had looked at Maya once in the gray on a fire escape, and known her and not been sorry. Risen now to full height, in the open, under the sky Homelander had believed was his. Maya on her knees, her hands still pressed flat to her own chest, watched the lid come off the world and knew, with a part of her that needs nothing explained, that she was the reason. And Homelander, who had spent the whole night trying to make a god look at him, got his wish. It looked at him. It had no eyes. It did not roar. That was the thing the world would never be told afterward, when the world had been handed a gentler thing to believe instead. It did not roar, and it did not burn, and it did not bring the tower down. It stood on a rooftop in the first gray of the morning with no eyes, and it began very quietly to subtract. A team had come up the stairwell behind Butcher. 6 of Edgar's people, because 40 stories below a man who managed gods for a living had at last understood that his most dangerous one had gone off the leash with a hostage and had sent the only thing he had left. They came through the roof door in a stack, trained, weapons up, and the man at the front got as far as the first syllable of an order. Then there were 5 of them. There was a gap where the 6th had been, and the order he had been giving was gone out of the air mid-word. Not cut off, not silenced. Gone as though the sentence had never had a 6th man to carry it. The 5 who remained did not watch him die, because he did not die. They felt instead the specific vertigo of a memory revising itself while they stood inside it. The fading animal certainty that there had been someone, that someone had been about to speak, the certainty thinning even as they reached for it, the way a sleeper reaches for a dream already gone. One of them turned to ask the man beside him where, and could not finish because there was no longer anywhere to ask about, and the dust their boots had kicked up drifted back down and found nothing person-shaped to land on, and settled instead into a wrong shape on the concrete, a smear the eye refused to hold. That was the thing the gold had been holding shut, not a fist, not the sun. An erasure, a quiet, patient subtraction of whatever stood too near the thing it had become, taking them not out of life, but out of the having lived, and the gap each one left was worse than a body, because a body at least insists that someone was here. Homelander attacked it. Of course he did. It was the only verb he had ever owned. He put the full red of his heat into the eyeless dark, the killing output, and the light went into the place where a man's face should be, and found nothing to do there. Not turned aside, the way it had turned aside off a politely apologizing man 11 days before, but undone, the way you cannot burn a hole that is already only whole. He flew at it. He brought 40 years of being the most dangerous thing in every sky down through the air in both fists, and his hands closed on cold and on nothing, passed through the idea of a man, and met only the temperature of the place where warmth had been, and the cold was the single answer he got. He hung there in the gray, screaming at an absence, and the absence did not regard him. It had already turned away. He was not a threat to it. He was not to the thing that unmade what it noticed, even worth the noticing, and being beneath the attention of the only creature that had ever overmatched him was the one experience Homelander's whole constructed life had been built never to have. His fury had no surface to land on. He was, for the first time, the second strongest thing on a rooftop and entirely powerless. And there was nothing his violence could touch, because you cannot strike a thing that is busy taking the world out of the record. On the stair, Billy Butcher lowered nothing, because he had lowered the rifle already and watched the lid come off the world exactly as he had said it would. He had been right. He had been right about all of it, on a garage floor, at the bottom of his own life, and he filed the rightness the way he filed everything, in its drawer. And it was the most useless true thing he had ever owned. There was no shot. There had never been a shot. He had spent his whole life as the man who took the shot, and the one time it mattered most, there was nothing in the world a shot could do, and so he stood and watched, which was the only thing left to him. and which he was very bad at. The hand at Maya's neck was gone. It had let go when the gold went out, Homelander forgetting her the instant a better fight arrived, the way he forgot everything that stopped being useful. And she knelt at the lip of the helipad, free, the wind coming up and the city going from black to slate below her, and a thing that erased standing 8 feet away, taking Edgar's men out of history one quiet absence at a time. She got up, and she walked toward it. Nothing else in the world could go near it and remain. Homelander's violence meant nothing. Butcher's certainty meant nothing. The 6 trained men were 5, and then they were fewer. Force could not reach it, because force was the wrong language, and the only thing the thing wanted was not a thing force could give it. But Maya it did not subtract. She walked into the cold, into the field of wrongness where the dust would not settle, and it let her, because she was the one warm thing it had reached for on a fire escape in the gray. The single thing in all of creation it did not want gone, but kept. The exception to the erasing, the one it loved. And close to it, inside the cold, she found the last flicker of the man. He was almost not there. He was a warmth going out, a shape at the bottom of the dark, the way the woman at the kitchen sink had become a shape at the bottom of his own thinning memory. And when she came near, he surfaced, the way he always surfaced for her, the one tide that still answered. His face came back into the front of the dark for a moment, exhausted past anything a body could carry, and he looked at her. And the dark spoke to him, in his own voice, the way it had only ever spoken into other people's heads. Turned inward now, gentle, reasonable, kind. "You're so tired," it said. "You've been holding it so long. You don't have to anymore. You can put it down. You can stop. Let go, and she'll be safe, and it will all be quiet, and you can finally rest." Every word of it was true. That was the trap, and there was no flaw in it to find. If he let go, she would be safe. The unmaking would stop, because the unmaking was only the struggle, only the thing fighting to get out, and a thing that has won has no more reason to fight. If he let go, he could stop. He could rest. He had wanted nothing else, ever, in this world or the one that no longer answered him. To do one good thing and have it be enough and be allowed to put it down. He was being offered the exact shape of his only wish, and the offer was honest, and accepting it would save the woman in front of him and quiet the end of the world. And he was right about all of it. He was only wrong about one thing, and it was the one thing no one had ever let him understand. The holding was not a cage on him. The holding was him. The will that said no, the goodness that reached to catch the falling and clear the civilians and set the broken thing down gently. That was the whole of what Robert Reynolds was, and the dark was everything left over when you took it away. To lay the holding down was not to rest. It was to stop being the one who held. And there would be no one to put the hand back to the chest, because the hand and the holding and the man were the same single thing. And he was about to set all 3 of them down at once and call it sleep. He looked at Maya. She had her hand pressed flat to her own chest. Their gesture, the fire escape word for hold it, don't, I am not worth the world. And he saw it, and he understood it, and for the first time in 11 days, he did not obey it. He smiled at her. It was the most tired and the most grateful thing she had ever seen on a human face, and he lifted his own hand away from his sternum. The hand that had held the door shut since the sky changed, lifted gently on purpose, choosing it, and let the door open. The cold stopped spreading. The dust somewhere began at last to fall the ordinary way, onto ordinary ground, because there was nothing left straining to get out into the world. The thing was already in it, complete, unopposed, at peace. The struggle ended because the struggler had laid himself down. He had saved her. He had saved all of them. He had been right. He was simply no longer there to know it. The city took a long time to scab over, and did it without being told the way cities do. The gray of that morning became other mornings. The smear on the rooftop was cleaned by someone paid to clean things and to ask nothing. Edgar's 6 men became, in the language of a binder, an incident, a containment event, a tragic systems failure, a number small enough to settle and large enough to look honest. And the families were seen to, generously, in exchange for a quiet that most of them were too broken to think of breaking. The light went amber and then short and then cold across a season. The campaign that had paused returned, gentler with a new word stitched through it. The word was recovery. The Sentry, the story went. And it was a good story, the best the company had ever told, because the best lies are the ones a frightened man has already half confessed. The Sentry had carried a great weight, and the weight had grown heavy, and there had been an episode, a crisis, the kind of human struggle that makes a hero only more beloved for having survived it. He had gotten help. He was well now. He was, the polling said, more trusted after the fall than he had ever been before it, because a nation will forgive a god anything except being unbreakable, and here at last was a god who had broken and mended and come back smiling. Stan Edgar read the final numbers on a page he initialed without quite finishing his tea, and was satisfied, in the cool way he permitted himself satisfaction, that an unstable asset had been stabilized and a historic brand restored. He had been correct about every line of it. The dread had been a containment cost. The cost had been contained. The asset performed. He had filed an apocalypse one drawer away from the truth and run the company on the contents of the drawer. And the company had never been worth more. And he would go to the end of his life having been right about everything and having stood for 11 days, 3 feet from a thing his whole exact intelligence had no instrument to see. They held the presser on a clear morning, the 2 of them on the vote stage, in front of the name and the lights and the rows of cameras, the established god and the recovered one, side by side, the family the company had always promised, finally and visibly at peace. And Homelander was at peace. That was the most damning thing in the room, and not one person in it could read it. He stood beside the golden figure, easy and warm, the old tightness gone out of his shoulders, a man at rest beside a colleague at last. And he could not have told anyone why he no longer minded. He had spent his whole life unable to bear a thing that was better than him, and the thing beside him had stopped being better than him, had stopped being kind, had stopped reaching to catch the falling, had stopped being anything Homelander would ever again have to measure himself against and come up short. There was nothing good left in it to be diminished by. His ease was the precise size of what the world had lost, and he wore it like a man who had finally been given a good night's sleep, and he did not know, and would never know, that the thing which had made room for his peace was the death of the only one of them who had ever been worth standing next to. The golden figure stepped to the podium, and the room went warm and quiet, and it spoke into the lights in a voice built for exactly this. "I just want to do some good," it said. It said it the way the man had said it once, alone to a dark window, on the first night, plainly, gently, and as though he meant it. The room believed it completely because it was the truest sounding thing anyone had ever heard a hero say, and because they had been hearing it for a year now, in gold letters 40 feet tall, and because it was, in the only sense the world could check, true. The applause came up in a wave. The line that had been his most defenseless confession, and then a trademark, and then the thing he understood too late to be the weapon. The line was the lid on him now, and it fit perfectly, because a hero who only wants to do good is the one disguise no one on earth will ever think to look behind. It would wear his goodness forever, and no one would ever know it was a mask, because the mask had become the face. Behind the podium, In the polished glass, the dark sheet of a sleeping teleprompter, the lacquered front of the lectern, the tower window throwing the stage back at itself. The reflection did not match the man. The golden figure at the podium had a face. The golden figure in the glass had a hole where the eyes should be, two openings into a lightless going back and back, the negative of a man, the same eyeless dark that had looked at one woman once in the gray of a fire escape, and known her and not been sorry, and risen at scale on a rooftop under a sky another god had believed was his. It was there in the glass, calm now, finished, at peace, and it was looking out of the reflection at the only person in the room who would ever see it. Maya was at the edge of the stage where the handler stands doing her job. That was the knife of it. She had kept the job. She was still in the machine, still clipboard and earpiece and badge clip square, still managing the appearances of the thing that wore the face of the man she had loved, because to leave would have required a reason she could never give, and because some part of her could not make herself walk away from the last place his shape still stood. She had spent the whole presser watching it, not its mouth, its hands. She had been watching all morning for the gesture, for the flat of a hand pressed to a sternum, the small, frightened thing he did when the dark leaned on the door. Their word, the one she had once laid her own hand over in the gray. She had been waiting for it the way you wait for a heartbeat you already know has stopped. It never came. Of course it never came. There was no fear left in the thing at the podium, no cage to hold, nothing straining to get out, no door to press shut. And the absence of the gesture was how she knew, past any glass, past any doubt, for certain, that the man who pressed his hand to his chest in terror was gone, that the world was applauding his murderer, that her own rescue had been the price of him, and that there was no true name to call him back by, and no fixed self left to summon. The very namelessness that had armored him against every threat in this world, leaving nothing, in the end, to grieve toward and nothing to restore. She knew all of it, and she could not say one word of it that anyone alive would believe, because there is no sentence in any language that carries that truth and does not sound, in a bright room full of applause, exactly like a woman who is broken. So she let the lie stand. She let the room have its God who got well. It was the only mercy left to give, and she gave it to the dead, who could not be helped, instead of to the living, who would not have listened. And then at the edge of the stage, watching the thing that would never again reach for its own chest, Maya Cole lifted the flat of her own hand and pressed it to the center of her own sternum. Their gesture, their word, spoken now alone, into a room that did not know it was a language, to a thing that could not answer, because the only one who had ever understood it was no longer there to hear. "I know," said her hand. "I know you're not in there. I know." The applause swelled. The golden figure smiled into the lights and let them love it. And in the glass behind it, the eyeless dark looked out at the one woman who would carry the truth in silence to the end of her life, and her hand stayed pressed flat to her chest and held the word no one would ever let her say. The transmission holds. Your unwavering focus, your absolute gaze, serves as the singular anchor point for these colliding realities. You didn't just watch, you stabilized the breach. Portal Comic X remains tethered to this plane only because you chose to endure the friction of the void until the very end. You are the battery, you are the witness. This channel is the only lens capable of capturing the collapse, and you are its pulse. Subscribe to the frequency now and step directly into the next anomaly. The portal is wide, and it is waiting.